This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 43 of Season 3 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, October 22nd, 1910, and I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford that week. The week starts with the Westford Center section. Mr. and Mrs. William A. Woodward of East Bridgewater were weekend guests of Mr. and Mrs. J. Herbert Fletcher. Warren Russell of Atkinson, New Hampshire, was a guest of his cousin, Mrs. M. J. Wheeler, last week. In the list of floral offerings at the funeral of Mrs. Mary E. Colburn last week, inadvertently, a handsome spray of roses from the Union Congregational Church was omitted. Augustus Bunce's many friends are glad that he is much more comfortable after the serious ill turn of last week. Nahum H. Wright, who has also had a serious ill turn, is resting comfortably. This is the busy season with the tax collector. Saturday of this week, he will be at George Mountain's store in Ford's Village from 1 to 2:30 and at Walter Wright's store in Graniteville from 3 to 4:30. George Mountain had a general store on what is now West Prescott Street, near that street's junction with East Prescott Street, that was started by his father, Edward Mountain. And Walter C. Wright operated the former Wright and Bemis Variety Store, located on Broadway at 3rd Street in Graniteville, taking over from his father, Arthur Wright. The fall meeting of the Middlesex Union Conference of Churches will meet with the church in Lancaster on Wednesday, October 26th, with a most attractive program outlined. Alec Fisher is having an extensive clearing of rocks in the large field owned by him at the junction of Cummings Road and Depot Street. Mr. and Mrs. Charles L. Hildreth and Mr. and Mrs. J. Herbert Fletcher attended the wedding of their classmate, Miss Gertrude Craven, at her home in Lowell on Wednesday evening, October 19th, to Mr. Robert H. Elliott, a son of Thomas H. Elliott, the well-known real estate dealer. Next Sunday will be observed as Rally Sunday in the various departments at the Congregational Church, and a full attendance at the services is earnestly requested. Mrs. Sarah Haywood Trumbull of Billerica has been visiting Miss Emily F. Fletcher and was a guest at the Tadmuck Club on Tuesday afternoon. It was pleasant to have as a guest Mrs. Martha Taylor Howard, who was formerly so helpful a member of the organization. Martha is a daughter of Samuel L. Taylor, who writes the About Town section of the Wardsman. The grading and other finishing touches of the pretty new dwelling house Walter J. Merritt has had built during the summer are being given, and Mr. and Mrs. Wiley M. Wright expect to move in next week. Mrs. John P. Wright, who underwent a surgical operation at her home in Lowell last week, is making as good progress towards recovery as can be expected. Mrs. Frances and Alice Wright were over Sunday guests with Dr. and Mrs. Orion Wells. Mr. Charles H. Bonney of Cambridge, who gave the address before the Tadmuck Club on Tuesday, was the guest on Tuesday and Wednesday of Reverend and Mrs. David Wallace. The next section is about the Tadmuck Club, the ladies' club in Westford. A most successful meeting of the Tadmuck Club was held in Library Hall on Tuesday afternoon. It was to be regretted that Mrs. Sarah Loker, owing to Mr. Bunce's illness, was unable to be present. August Bunce was Mrs. Loker's brother-in-law, and she lived with August and her sister. In her absence, the Vice President, Miss Ella Hildreth, presided most acceptably. The subject for the afternoon was greeting from the Cantabrigia Club, Cambridge, by its president, Mrs. Charles H. Bonney, and Reminiscences of Cambridge by Reverend Benjamin H. Bailey. Mr. Bonney combined a charming personality and the ability to tell things most capably and clearly. The message that she had to bring from a club whose membership numbers 500 to our modest unaffiliated club of 75 was stimulating and helpful. She outlined some of her club's activities, its influence and responsibilities, its service and opportunity, elucidating particularly its efforts for civic betterment, such as the elimination of billboards, for a saner Fourth, for good literature and dramas, and its attitude toward the cheaper class of moving pictures, and in closing, gave the real aim of the CAT Abridged Club as embodied in its motto, quote, "To make tomorrow better than today," end quote. Reverend Mr. Benjamin Bailey rounded out the afternoon's program with reminiscences of student experiences of his alma mater, Harvard College. He received his Bachelor of Arts degree there in 1854, and he graduated from the Divinity School in 1860. The next meeting of the club should prove of much interest to all the members, which is an address on, quote, "Conflicting Ideals in Education," end quote, by Frederick H. Hill, Superintendent of Schools. Next, we come to the About Town section. The next meeting of the Board of Registrars will be held at Healy's Hall, Graniteville, Monday evening, October 24th. Forge Village on Wednesday evening, October 26th at Abbott's Hall. Town Hall on Saturday, October 29th, from noon until 10 p.m. The selectmen have made the following appointments of precinct officers to serve at the state election November 8th. Precinct 1, Walter J. Merritt, Warden; Leonard Wheeler, Deputy Warden; John Fletcher, Clerk; Albert Haywood, Deputy Clerk; William Henry Harrison Burbeck, and Thomas Arthur Wilson, Inspectors; William McDonald, Deputy Inspector. Precinct 2, Albert Wall, Warden; Timothy Riney, Deputy Warden; William H. Beebe, Clerk; J.W. Prynne, Deputy Clerk; Hammett Wright, Joseph Wall, Inspectors; Charles Blodgett and Melvin Edwards, Deputy Inspectors. Precinct 3, Michael McGlinchey, Warden; Peter J. McGlinchey, Deputy Warden. They were brothers. William R. Taylor, Clerk; Charles S. Edwards, Deputy Clerk; William J. Donnelly, Houghton G. Osgood, Inspectors; Amos Poley, Charles M. Troll, Deputy Inspectors. Precinct 4, Alvin Bennett, Warden; David Lord, Deputy Warden; Fred Reed, Clerk; Edson G. Boynton, Deputy Clerk; John Edwards, Arthur H. Comey, Inspectors; John Flynn and James Wiggum, Deputy Inspectors. The tropical Indian summer weather is developing summer blossoms and fruit. Chelmsford reports ripe strawberries, and the writer reports a pear tree in full blossom in Lowell. This he has seen without the aid of anyone else's eyesight. The selectmen and management of the Lowell and Fitchburg Railroad have decided that folks must be 5 minutes earlier than by their past record, as the starting time of the first car will be 6:55 instead of at 7 o'clock. Charles O. Prescott and Edward Fisher represented the First Parish of Westford as delegates to the Unitarian Conference at Lowell on Wednesday. Besides the delegates, 15 volunteers took their privileges and counted as part of the enthusiasm of the old historic church. At the Republican rally on Wednesday, Alonzo Walsh of Lowell, William Wilder of Gardner, the Honorable Frank Bennett Jr. of Saugus, and Judge John J. Pickman of Lowell, and candidate James H. Wilkins of Carlisle answered roll call as they were severally introduced to recite their lessons. They were all marked up perfect by the teacher who introduced them to recite. It was an evening of real profit, these gentlemen speaking well. I have a suspicion that the MC for the evening was Samuel L. Taylor, but can't tell for sure here. The switch track at Westford Station will soon be extended towards the Stone Arch Bridge in the direction of where Graniteville nestles in the valley. The Honorable Herbert E. Fletcher is ill at his home on Oak Hill and under the restrictions of a physician. These restrictions prevented his being present or presiding at the Republican rally held on Wednesday evening. The speakers were all eloquent with good cheer and good advice. Another little son, Stanley Law Snow, arrived on Friday, October 14th, at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Frederick Allen Snow of West Chelmsford. This little boy was Samuel L. Taylor's grandson. At this harvest time of the year, there's an opportunity to look back and see what the products of the fields have been. One family reports that from 3 trees of Gravensteins, 94 bushels of apples were sold, and this makes no account whatever of the apples that fell and were not sold. As some of the apples brought fine prices in the market, the net return from these 3 trees was very gratifying. Mrs. Littlefield of Fitchburg and her son Fred Littlefield of Farmington, New Hampshire, were recent guests at Charles Walker's. Mrs. C. Abby Butterfield of Tingsboro, for a long time an honored teacher in the Old Red Schoolhouse of Stony Brook District, was in town this week visiting old-time friends. She planned the new schoolhouse and was the last teacher in the old building and the first in the new one. Miss Maria Bunce of Lowell and Henry Bunce of North Chelmsford have been guests at the Bunce homestead during the illness of Mr. Bunce. Next, we have the Ford's Village section. The Ladies' Sewing Circle held a bean supper in Recreation Hall, that was at St. Andrew's Mission, Saturday evening, which was a very enjoyable affair. The tables looked very attractive and inviting and were well laden with many good things. Supper was served from 6 to 8 o'clock and was in charge of Mrs. Nelson Prescott, Mrs. Hugh Ferguson, Mrs. David Lord, Mrs. George Sanborn, Mrs. William Fernald, and Mrs. Henry Catchpole. The affair was for the benefit of St. Andrew's Mission. Mrs. Hovey and Mrs. Rand of Ayer were among the out-of-town people that were present. Reverend Max L. Kellner, professor of the Theological School at Cambridge, I presume that's at Harvard, occupied the pulpit at St. Andrew's Mission Sunday. Mr. and Mrs. Henry Catchpole spent the weekend as the guests of Mr. and Mrs. Spencer of Clinton. Miss Emily and John W. Catchpole, children of Mr. and Mrs. Henry Catchpole, spent Saturday and Sunday with their sister and brother-in-law, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Mason of Lowell. Mr. and Mrs. Albert Bailey and 2 children, Lillian and Lester of Lowell, spent Sunday as the guests of Mr. and Mrs. Miles Collins. Arrangements are being made for a football match between the Buntings of Lowell and a picked team from this village and Graniteville to be played in Lowell on Saturday afternoon. George Wilkinson of Harvard spent Sunday with his mother, Mrs. Joseph Wilkinson. Mr. and Mrs. David Lord entertained Mr. and Mrs. Harrison Sargent and their little granddaughter, Arlene Farmer of Pepperell, over Sunday. Miss Teresa Lowther and Miss Rachel Cherry were weekend guests of Miss Catherine Lowther of Andover. A daughter, her name was Adna Green Comey, was born to Mr. and Mrs. Arthur H. Comey on Saturday, October 15th. Miss Ida M. Phillips, a former teacher at Cameron School, and Miss Lillian M. Phillips of the teaching staff of the Oakdale Intermediate School were visitors at Cameron School on Monday. During their short stay, they called on old friends and were entertained at tea by Mr. and Mrs. George O. Jackson. Mr. and Mrs. James Benoit have the sympathy of their many friends in the loss of their only child, Laura, who died on Sunday night after a short illness, aged 2 months. Spinal meningitis was the cause of death. The funeral took place on Tuesday afternoon. The bearers were Masters Maxine Ricard, Silver Benoit, Joseph Milo, and Medasi Pamilton. Burial was in St. Catherine's Cemetery. The Ladies' Sewing Circle met at Recreation Hall on Thursday afternoon. After the usual work, a lunch was served. The members of the John Edwards Hose Company will hold their third annual ball in Abbott Hall on Saturday evening, October 22nd. Music will be furnished by Thayer's Orchestra of Pepperell. An oyster supper will be served at intermission. This will be the last affair to be held in the hall for some weeks, as it will undergo repairs and will be painted and decorated inside. A library has been arranged in the teacher's room of Cameron School for the benefit of the school children. The books are loaned from the J.V. Fletcher Library and are greatly appreciated by the children. Books are renewed once a week. The next paragraph is about a death. Mrs. Alice M. Mountain, wife of George E. Mountain, passed away at her home on Central Street. Central Street is now West Prescott Street, I believe. On Friday afternoon, October 14th, after a long and very painful illness, aged 54 years. Mrs. Mountain had been a resident of this village for many years and was highly esteemed and was very generous when appealed to for any worthy cause. She will be greatly missed by a large circle of friends. Besides her husband, she leaves one sister, Mrs. Charles Gray, and two brothers, Alex Courtney of Brookside and Richard Courtney of Humphreys Street, Lowell. Funeral services were held on Sunday afternoon at her late home and were attended by a large number of relatives, neighbors, and friends. Reverend David Wallace of the Congregational Church of Westford conducted the services, and appropriate selections were sung by Mrs. David L. Grieg and Mrs. Homer Seavey. The bearers were George Baker of Ayer, George E. Sanborn, George O. Jackson, Francis Lowther, Augustin W. Karkin, and Edmund J. Hunt of this village. There was a wealth of beautiful flowers, the last offerings of loving friends. Burial was in Fairview Cemetery, Westford. That's the news in Westford for the week ending October 22nd, 1910. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of WestfordCAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from days gone by. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.